Tired of the stereotypes?
Done with being overlooked?
It's time to change the narrative.
Welcome to East of Me, Tales in the Tea. We're your host, Ji-Hye Choi, a Korean immigrant settler in so-called Canada.
And Samantha Louis Poon, a second-generation Chinese settler in so-called Canada. And this is a podcast where we'll be sipping tea and spilling the tea on the real experiences of East Asian women in North America.
One book, one story, and one conversation at a time. Let's get into it.
All right, so today we're going to be sharing our reflections of the book Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. We're very excited. Yay! So how did you like the book?
It was long.
It was very long.
It was longer than I expected, but because I watched the show before, I think I was able to read through it pretty fast. It was very interesting to read, in the sense that it was very captivating. There are so many stories, so many characters, and then generational stories. And I think it was impressive because the author, I could tell she studied a lot of regarding the history, because it was just very enriched. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What did you think?
I absolutely loved the book, and one thing that I really enjoyed was the idea of generational stories. So we go, back and forth between generations. And one of the themes that I think was really prominent, obviously, in this book was the idea of colonization. Mm-hmm. And so did you want to maybe give a little bit of a background on colonization in regards to this book specifically?
Yeah. So we can talk about the Japanese colonization of Korea. And then that happened during 1910 to 1945. And then the book also mentions the Korean War, which took place between 1950 to 1953. So for context, 1945, that was only 80 years ago. Sunja could be my grandmother's age. Although I don't have any living grandparents anymore. If my grandma was still alive, I would think she would be Sunja's age. So my grandparents, when they were alive, they went through colonization and war. And my parents, for example, they were born in the 1960s. So they grew up post-colonization, but pretty much in the post-war era. So that's kind of the history. When I relate it to my family, it just feels like really wasn't that long ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's so important about books in general, or even movies, film, and other art pieces, is that it resonates with people's lived experiences now and not the far, distant past. And so these are not just, stories that are coming out from fictional characters and just something that's far away. It actually is very personal, and what you were saying, very personal to you, your family, your family's history, and like you were saying, Sunja can be your grandmother, right? Mm-hmm. That's what's so impactful. When you think of it that way, these stories need to be told in ways that are maybe accessible to larger audience, so people can almost reflect and see how different people in different places in the world, different generations, different families have stories that are different from our own, and it's important to tell them.
Yeah, I guess if I think about my grandparents, for example, so I was very close to my maternal grandmother when she was alive. So she was kind of like my second mom. When my parents were working, she was kind of the primary caregiver. And my grandma would often use Japanese words just randomly. I can't even think of one right now, but we'll be talking in Korean and all of a sudden she'll just say a random Japanese word and be like, what does that mean? Like, what is that? And then she'll say, oh, it's Japanese. And I'll say, well, you're Korean, why are you using Japanese words? And then she said, well, like, we weren't actually allowed to speak Korean. They had to, go to Japanese schools, only speak Japanese, couldn't wear a hanbok, which is our traditional outfit. My bookmark.
Yeah, I love that.
And yeah, it would just the way of colonization that like it was stripping away our culture. Being Korean was not a good thing at the time. So yeah, to me, like, I guess like I was really naive. I didn't know about the history at the time. So I thought, oh, that's funny. She's Korean, but she's using Japanese. But that's one thing that always like stuck out to me, that like my grandma and people in her generation would often use a lot of Japanese words. And then even some of the words that we use day to day might have some Japanese words. So I think it's, at least for me, I try to use like Korean words as much as possible when I can. But the other thing that I remember her talking about, or just know from other families, is that especially the post-Korean War era, there was very severe poverty at the time. So everybody was very poor. Everybody had to work very hard to rebuild the nation. So sometimes I think about how much of a miracle it is for Korea, or at least South Korea, to be where it is today in terms of our, financial situation. We went from poverty to one of the top countries with, GDP. And we got K-pop, like BTS, and we got K-pop Demon Hunters now.
Yeah.
And even for me, like back in the days when I first immigrated to North America, people did not know where Korea was. Or if they do, they'd be like, north or south. But now everybody knows where Korea is. Shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people know where it is. And there was somebody that tried to take our culture away, but here we are thriving with our culture and then spreading it everywhere, clearly. So I think that's super cool. But in terms of like the intergenerational trauma and then the effects of colonization and war, is that there was a lot of, alcoholism, for example, or maybe the parents really struggled with parenting. There might be like neglect or even abuse. And there was only maybe, 2 generations, maybe even 1 generation ago. So I feel like we're still healing from the effects of that, because like I said, it hasn't been very long ago. But because we've gotten so much better compared to where we were financially, I feel like sometimes we kind of forget about the emotional, psychological impacts, perhaps, because money can't buy everything. Can't fix everything. So we might be okay financially. Not all of us. But more money, more problems.
Yes. But that's like the thing, right? It's healing or even like resisting against like oppressions. It takes a long time to heal from. And what is healing anyways? Like, what do we even mean when we say healing? Because we're in a constant state of, trying to look after wellness and well-being and ourselves and our community and our family. And so I think for healing, like, it's a constant state of, inwards and also like outwards through community and culture and language as well, and reclaiming that. And one thing that you were saying that really resonated with me was the idea of language and culture. When we think about the effects of colonization and any other like systemic oppressions that occur to minoritized groups, is the idea of loss of language and loss of culture. And these are so, important for people's well-being and just joy and happiness in life. But then when that gets stripped away, just, for a community or for a group of people, and then that gets, passed on through generations, it's so hard to like go back to what your roots are and what your culture is, and even celebrating that, right? And so I think it's so important when we think of language and culture in relation to colonization. Like, these are important parts of what is being stripped away from people and from communities and families, and also how people can turn to, resisting these oppressions. I'm Chinese, and I never actually learned Chinese. And so that, the language for my family kind of stopped at my generation. And it happens to a lot of people and a lot of families. And so these are important things to think about, especially when, we're living in this context and everyone, thinks English is just, the default, the norm, something that, the status quo. And so we need to think beyond that. And how can people actually reclaim parts of their family's language and different dialects, and that's part of healing and that journey as well. So these are such important themes and narratives like in this book, but also that resonate with both of our lives and both of our families' lives, and I'm sure just so many other people as well.
Yeah. If I could quote K-pop Demon Hunters. There's a song called Free. And there's one like part in the lyrics that really resonate with me, and I think Rumi goes, "What if we heal what's broken?" And that gets me every time, because it really hits home, because I feel like a lot of us haven't really healed what's broken, or we like to be a little bit delusional about it and hope that we have when we haven't, or even if we have, if maybe our parents and grandparents haven't fully, grasped the realities of like what they have gone through, maybe that gets passed down, and then maybe we all deal with the same thing. And when you were kind of sharing earlier, what came up for me was this like idea of shame, like, not being able to use your own language, and then not being able to practice cultural practices. There's almost like the shame in who you are and like what you represent, and then even like living is a sin, So I think I really wanted to mention that. So maybe what's broken is our identity, and then like broken with like cracks of shame. And then maybe the healing is putting it back together, and like you said, like reclaiming the identity. I'm gonna sip because that was good.
That was good. Good job, G.
And I was gonna ask you, you said your family, like, you don't speak Chinese, and then was that on purpose, or was that for assimilation perhaps?
Definitely assimilation, right? So in my family's immigration story, both my sets of grandparents spoke Chinese. My parents speak Chinese because that's how they communicated with their parents. And then, as we move on the generations, it's, you lose your language, right? So we never learned, me and my siblings never learned Chinese, as part of growing up. And in the household, it was always English that was spoken. You look back and like, I always wish that I learned Chinese, but this is also something that it's so complex and nuanced when we think about it, and people's decisions and parents' decisions to teach their children certain languages, whether it's, family's dialect or, English, or maybe a combination of both. And, in my situation, it is about assimilation, right? Because when we think about the effects of when you're talking about shame, when you're talking about practicing your culture, speaking, your language, like these are all components that in the larger system that we're embedded within, like it is almost like shameful to speak Chinese in different settings, or speak to your. I remember growing up and being hearing my mom and or my mom and grandparents speak Chinese to each other in like public settings, and almost feeling that embarrassment, right? Because it is that shame that's like so deep rooted in our identities and how we are like forming as children, and where does that even come from, right? And we think about it, and it's a larger system of oppression that's telling us that who we are, our identity, our language, our cultures are not okay. And that's, a huge part of what I've been trying to reclaim as I get older is, practicing, different cultural traditions and learning about it. I do want to learn Chinese, Cantonese specifically. And so these are different components that, I've kind of navigated in my own life, and how it resonates with this book and your story as well. And it's just, and I know that there's other people out there that, experience, similar, I guess, journeys in their life as well. And the idea of shame is such a huge part of, being just East Asian generally growing up, right? And, I was mentioning, and you were mentioning, like, shame can be part of, what's kind of like breaking the identity, and like, how do we actually then go and heal it? Like, how do we, I mean, for you, like you practice this like in your professional life of like, how do you then, navigate shame related to culture and related to being East Asian, right? Like that's something that, I am personally interested in, if you want to share like, anything about that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my approach generally is to actually allow people to talk about their experiences of shame, because I think it's really important to name it, and to be able to talk about those things, because like you said, it's very embarrassing. You almost want to forget about it. Sometimes you kind of do because of trauma, of course. Yeah. But really letting people know it's not okay that they've experienced that. And if nobody really helped them or nobody really acknowledged it as such, then it's me who would say, like, that was not okay. That wasn't supposed to happen. And I guess by talking about it and then sharing the stories, it becomes real, instead of like a forgotten memory or something that you shove deep down and then it comes out when you're feeling bad about yourself. But really bringing it out to the forefront and then opening up about it, so that it's not like some dark secret that you have to hold on to forever. Because I think oftentimes we just want to believe that life is all great. And if we only think positive, it'll get better. My approach also is to expand the narrative, like providing context to the shame. So where does it come from? Is it a friend or is it a frenemy? Where do you want to go with the shame? Do you want to continue to be besties? Or do you want to maybe say, I've outgrown this relationship and I think it's time I move on? Then we go with it. But oftentimes, a lot of people that I've talked to usually have really terrible experiences of just being who they are, how they look, maybe how they smell even, or even the accents they have. I mean, in the book, they talk about Sunja's sister-in-law with her perfect Japanese, right? And then English came up because obviously your family wanted to make sure you speak perfect English, and me as an immigrant, I had to make sure I speak perfect English. So see, English just, like we said, default, it just came out.
One thing that you said that I think was really profound is the idea of that these experiences of shame are real.
Yes.
Right? And that is like hitting me right now in terms of like when we think about, our childhood or, just like thinking back, even being a young adult, like going through those experiences of shame related to identity.
Yeah.
And actually having someone validate that these are real experiences, these are real feelings, and how do we then move forward? But just what you said, like naming the shame, naming the feeling, and also, being validated that it is real, because it is, right? And like, that's a huge thing that, maybe if there's like one message, it's like, yeah, these experiences are real. Like, no one is making them up. You're not making it up in your head. Let's not be gaslit like this, right?
Yeah.
Like, so, I think that was really, really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. We gotta call it for what it is. Let's sip to the
sip. And there was one thing that you also mentioned that I just have to go back to it.
Okay.
It's like, what you mentioned, something really quickly about how people smell, or like, and for me, like, in my memory, and even like what's coming up for me right now, is the idea of Chinese food, right? And being so ashamed of Chinese food, and always being like, I want a sandwich for lunch. I want like all these like, I don't know, fruit roll-ups, right?
Yep.
Like, it's like you want like the white people food, and the foods that, you won't feel like embarrassed about, because then when people, you bring something that's Chinese, and, everyone's looking around, and you're like, oh, what's that smell, and everything. So yeah, that's definitely a part of like, being Chinese for me. Like, that has been part of like the identity of, how it's kind of creeped into my life of like, it almost I almost have to like reclaim it every single time when I like eat Chinese food in public, or like I bring, Asian food for like lunch or to the office or something. So it's that's a huge part. And the way that we look as well, like, ever grow up and people like make fun of your eyes, your like hair,
call you ugly,
yeah,
because you look different. I'm like,
you look,
thanks.
yes, exactly.
Feel so confident.
Yeah, like all these different like parts of, like, even I like development as a child, like, this is profound. Like, this is so impactful for someone's like growth and development, and then moving on into like early adulthood and, adulthood. So it's like, wow, we just have to like navigate so much on a constant basis, and this is why everyone needs therapy.
Yeah, but when you were just sharing right now, like, I thought about like Sunja, for example. Like, she ends up making all these like banchan, like the side dishes. But even the side dishes, I guess she started with making kimchi at first, and then I think in the book they talked about like Japanese people walking by and then like giving her the stink eyes, and then covering their noses being like, ew, like, what's that smell, so that obviously stands out for me. And I would actually I think now I might be okay, but I would still be scared to bring kimchi to work lunchroom, for example. It's fermented, so it will smell, of course, but how people go about saying that is usually quite dramatic. So that part really stood out for me. But even when Sunja and the sister-in-law started working at the restaurant and they started selling banchan, I feel like even those ones, they had to like curate the banchan and like make it appealing to these like rich Japanese customers, so it's like, kimchi smelly, we don't like it, but these nice banchan at like a fancy restaurant, we will accept. So it's just how you package it, or how you sell it, or how it's perceived can be very different. And even with the sister-in-law, I keep talking about the sister-in-law, but like, she spoke perfect Japanese, but she was also very like slender and then dressed like the Japanese. So like growing up and then, having different food, eating different food, or even if I didn't bring Korean lunches, sometimes I would still smell like Korean food that my mom would make. And I'd be like, oh my God, somebody's going to say something. It's just scared to go to school sometimes. I went to a lot of schools that were mostly like white dominated. So I definitely stuck out like a sore thumb. Let me tell you. And then I think for me, it was even a bigger culture shock because when I lived in Korea, I was part of the dominant culture, right? So I didn't think anything else of like what I ate, what I looked like, what I smelled like, or what I did. But then after moving to North America, I'm like, oh, I look very different from a lot of these folks. And they talk different, they look different, they dress different, they talk different. And I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? So, yeah, that was scary.
Yeah. It's so hard to navigate. Like, it's, feeling and actually being like the person that is different, from, everyone else. It's so hard to navigate for a child, but even now, like it's still hard to navigate in workspaces and, just generally in society navigating. Like it's so hard. And the idea of like, for you, like being, in Korea and then immigrating, and then kind of having that realization. I think that's really impactful for, someone's like overall well-being, or even just like where that shame may like stem from, right? Like it's so almost alarming to go through that, transition. For me, like it was kind of the opposite, where I grew up always feeling like a little bit different, and I never knew anything else besides feeling different. And then I remember in my early 20s, I went to Hong Kong for the first time.
How was that?
And I remember, like getting out of the airport and then just crying because I was like, is this what it's like to be white in Canada? And like to be in the school system and, feel it like, I might not speak the same language as people, but I felt like there was some sort of almost like my nervous system relaxing, because it's like, okay, I don't feel, like out of place. Like even though I am not speaking Cantonese, like it felt like just, when people were looking at me, it was just, I didn't, I wasn't like the odd person out, right?
No.
Just walking on the street. So I think having these like different realizations for, for me, whether it's like, going, back to your ancestors, like home, or for you, like it's almost like having it early on and then transitioning. Like I think these are kind of different components in identity that it's interesting to like navigate and go through.
If I'm being brutally honest, nobody told me how it was gonna go, because most of the time people think, oh, like you immigrate for a better life, or it's gonna be like the white picket fences and it's gonna be all great. But I think like Sunja, for example, her family, when they moved to Japan, they didn't know what was gonna hit them. You know what I mean? They also thought things were gonna get better, but in some ways, sure, but I can't say it was what they thought it was going to be. And that's what I also kind of like related to. And then, and later on in the book, there's, Sunja family talks about like, and maybe it's not just her family, but like other Koreans in the book will talk about how like, oh, you stay in Japan, you betrayed your country, but if you go back to Korea, you kind of like lose everything you've built in Japan. And then, I feel like maybe a lot of like immigrants feel that way.
Yeah, and I think that's like one of the major, themes out of this book as well, is the idea of, we were talking about a lot of identity and how people navigate that, in addition to this idea of like home, like where is home, right? And like what is that feeling, or where do you get pulled to based on how your identity is forming, what you're resonating with, the idea that you're mentioning, immigrating for this better life, but does that mean like it's going to feel like home, or it is actually going to be better?
Yeah, it's the whole idea of like neither here nor there kind of vibe is kind of the sentiment that I heard from a lot of the characters in the book. And then I feel that way sometimes because, like, in so-called Canada, I wouldn't say I'm part of the majority, especially where we live in Edmonton. And if I were to go visit Korea right now, I would feel a little out of place also, just because I grew up by now, I guess, like more than half of my life in North America. So now I feel like I'm more North American, but what does that even mean? Right? And when people ask me about my background, I don't really know what to say because I don't know if there is a correct answer or the right answer. Not that I need to have one, but maybe it's the shame, feeling like you need to know who you are, feeling like maybe you can only pick one. But then I'm like, I don't think I can just pick one because I have some experience here and some experience here. And I can't just pick one because then am I betraying the other? Or does that mean I'm not grateful for this other culture that kind of helped shape me? So, yeah, I noticed that a lot in the book. And then through the generations, the younger generations maybe feel more Japanese or maybe identify more with living in Japan and then being okay with it. So it's like for me, if I feel okay, maybe being more settled in, so-called Canada, like, does that make me a bad Korean? Like, am I less Korean? So, yeah. It's mixed feelings.
It is mixed feelings. And it's also, there's no like wrong answer to this, right?
Because I know.
Right? Like, and that's like the thing is, I think when people think about identity, like identity, it has to be tied to something, and
like
you can only
tangible.
Something tangible, and you can only be that one thing for the rest of your life once you identify as whatever.
Scary.
So it's, but I think like that's such a narrow way to look at life and people and experiences that we have, and how experiences will shape us along the way, and that we can have actually multiple identities at the same time, right? So I think it's so much more nuanced and complex than what people sometimes perceive it to be. And I think that's something that was so relevant in terms of this book, is that the navigation of different identities and how do we hold multiple identities at the same time for ourselves, and also to not have other people have to accept that. Like, it's okay to if someone makes a judgment, it's fine, like to be able to move on from that and do what's best for who you are, and what feels right for you. Like, I've never felt like there was any place that is actually like home, right? Because it's like I never felt like fully felt like I belong here in so-called Canada, and at the same time, like if I went to Hong Kong, I wouldn't feel that as well, like and so I think there's like, it's almost like this in-between space of like we can navigate kind of that complexity across different times or spaces and with different people. And I think that's kind of almost the beauty in it, though, because I often think of it as like a deficit, or like something that was always wrong. But maybe that's like, we can start to think of it as like something that's almost like beautiful and like enlightening, because it's like, wow, like you are different, and there is like this in-between space, but maybe that in-between space, like we can form our own communities and places that we feel that we belong and resonate with, which I feel like is what kind of we navigated through in terms of like identity and like shared identities, and what that process looks like.
It's pretty much makes us adaptable, in my opinion, and I think it really expands our perspectives compared to maybe having been exposed to like limited beliefs and values. We kind of had to navigate more than one and various sets of beliefs and values and then experiences. So I do feel like definitely felt like a deficit, like you said, just because the idea or this feeling of like, ooh, I don't fit in, I'm different, something's wrong with me, you know, like because of that feeling, definitely did not see it as a strength. But now that I'm older, maybe have a better idea of who I am as a person, it feels more like a strength. Although on bad days, I might think of it as a double-edged sword sometimes, you know? Can't say I'm confident all the time, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think the in-between, sometimes it makes us flexible and adaptable, but yeah, maybe just on bad days you feel a little lost, but that's okay. Because as you and I connected on this concept, we realized we feel the same.
Yeah.
You know? So knowing that there are other people like us out there, I think that feels good to me, that this is not a like just like an individual experience, like single experience, but that it's like universal, right? So knowing that, I guess, makes me feel good in that I'm not crazy.
And you're not. Like, this is what you're saying. It's, you know, everyone will have their own experiences, and that's for them to experience. But no one is alone in any of these experiences, right? And there's always going to be a shared experience, and it's nice to find community in that. And I think like this idea of being adaptable, and like kind of being, you know, can go between different spaces, and that almost you know, reminds me of, you know, this idea of resilience, and how like people you know, always talk about, you know, oh, you're so resilient, and you know, it often comes from like psychology, where it's like the person needs to kind of adapt to the environment, and instead of like the systemic oppressions you know, changing, which is like a very individualistic point of view, instead of, you know, how can communities come together. So it's just different ways of looking at it. And I think like even in the narratives we hear, like just generally right now, like, oh, resilience is like everyone needs to be resilient, like go be resilient.
I think resilience is a beautiful thing, but sometimes I feel like it's something people have developed out of survival, out of necessity. Yes, resilience makes somebody strong, but at what cost, and like where did that come from? So sometimes it's a whole shame thing and the history thing where people are like, just be resilient, focus on but then you gotta know where the resilience came from, right? So I love that this book talked about resilience. I mean, it kind of like touched on the theme of resilience, but it like focused heavily on the history and then the intergenerational trauma, so I really appreciated that. But in terms of resilience, like I mean, we start with Sunja, like, man, she's been through it. I don't even know what to say. I feel like, wow.
Yeah.
I don't even know if resilience captures everything she had to go through and overcome. Like, I feel like it's not even resilience. It doesn't even feel worthy of a word to use. Like, in Korean culture, we talk a lot about, like, endurance. Like, there's a heavy emphasis on endurance. And when you endure and endure, there's going to be light at the end of the tunnel. Like, that's what we've been like told, and you can see that in Sunja, right? She just endures and I hope it gets better, but I don't know if things got really better for her. And sometimes when I work with people, I also point that out, especially with like Korean people, to say like, you don't always have to endure, you know, and sometimes there isn't a light at the end of the tunnel, so it's okay if you want to walk out the other way.
I don't think we focus enough, like, as the conversation in society in general, this idea that I love what you said, resilience comes from somewhere, right? And almost it's like a mechanism of, you know, when you're trying to survive, like, is that truly resilience when you're forced into environments that are not meant for you, that there's larger systems at play that you cannot change? Like, why are we always telling people you just have to be resilient? right? Like it, and like you were saying, like, does it always get better? Maybe, but you know, sometimes it doesn't. And I think like we have to be able to acknowledge that, you know, oftentimes when we're saying resilience, it's actually people just trying to survive on a day-to-day basis, regardless of what it is. You're mentioning the idea of poverty at the beginning. You're meant like that's all related to capitalism and colonial systems and states. Like that's how can you tell someone just to be, you know, resilient?
Oh my God, resourceful.
Just be resourceful. Right? Like it's such a, it's so, I think we need to definitely change the narrative and perspective on that because people like, I think that almost comes from, and I feel like we're going off topic, but this idea of like, that's almost like a word that's framed from whiteness. Because it's like, okay, if you're not against all these systemic oppressions, okay, maybe resilience, you know, people need to be resilient on a day-to-day basis just to get through the day. But when come face to face with these systems, whether it's capitalism, colonialism, like the interplay of capitalist colonial systems, like other forms of systemic oppressions, like there's no way to just do it as an individual and change who you are, because it's, you know, it's going to result in this idea that we're talking about on identity and shame, and how do you then navigate all these different components. So it's such a like a,
it's very relevant to what we're talking about. And then it's kind of like it's like if you're not resilient enough, then it's like you're the individual's failure, even though we're talking about like systemic failures. And it feels like victim shaming, you know? If you're not resilient, you just didn't try hard enough, you just didn't endure enough. But then I'm like, when is it gonna be enough? Like, how much suffering is enough?
Exactly.
You know? So yeah, resilience, it's a tough word to use, and I use it sparingly, and I use it contextually, because I think it means different things in different contexts. And then the book doesn't talk about this at all, but one of the stories that I actually heard from my mom, not directly from my grandma, but or maybe my grandma had mentioned it before, but I can't remember, but the story of comfort women. So essentially, like my grandma, for example, she got married quite young. I guess back in the days, like people got married much younger, but she essentially got married to avoid being sent off to be part of the comfort women for Japanese soldiers. And to me, that feels like we don't really have a choice in who you marry, and marriage almost seemed out of survival and necessity at the time. So yeah, second-class citizen during colonization and after too. But also this whole idea of comfort women, very scary.
Yeah, and what this continues to come back to is like the idea of when you're colonized, like you're forced into certain states and like places where you don't have a choice. And
oppression, literal oppression. Yes,
people often don't have a choice. Right. And we're so privileged, you know, when we are able to make different choices in different contexts, when, you know, a lot of people can't. Like, it is just a constant state of survival, and it is so, I don't even know a right word for it right now, but it's just...
There's no word to, like, console the experience, I don't think. There's no way to, like, because, like, if you were met with Sunja right now, what can you say that would make her feel better? Absolutely nothing. If we can turn back time and then not have all these things happen to her, maybe. But then she did say at the end that she is still not happy, but she's okay with how things played out because of the family that she has, and then like maybe the lives that they have. But yeah, when I think about all the hardships that she had to go through, like in terms of like patriarchy, even the fact that she and her sister-in-law had to work so much, take care of the house, make sure, you know, you feed the kids and look after the kids. And even when the brother-in-law got sick, the sister-in-law, she stood by him till his last day. And it's like one of those roles that they have accepted and maybe, I don't want to say never questioned, but like rarely questioned. And you know, as the generation go by, you can see like with his girlfriend, for example, she like denounces patriarchy. You know, she'd be like, I don't cook in the kitchen, like we do takeouts or you know, things like that. But Sunja and the sister-in-law, they're like, you can do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Your mom doesn't make you Korean food?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I remember. And like, you don't cook?
Yeah. I thought it was so funny, but so true.
Yeah.
But so they obviously didn't get to question it as much or didn't even think that that was an option. But when we also look at their context, did they really have time to question patriarchy when the whole colonization was happening? Probably not.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Look at the time. Hour went by so fast. Almost an hour.
Almost an hour. Wow. That's amazing. Yeah, these concepts are so important to talk about. So we'll definitely keep exploring this in the next episode and, further our conversation on good Korean and bad Korean and what that looks like.
Awesome.
See you in the next episode.